Welcome to another episode of the Vinimark podcast, where we explore the leading edges of wine commerce, science, seller mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers. Now, this episode comes hot off the heels of an incredible webinar on biodynamics, organics, and natural wine. Incidentally, if you missed the webinar, it's now available to be viewed on Vinimark's YouTube channel, and it has an all-star panel including Jamie Good, Johan Reinecker, Christina Rasmussen, David Clark, and of course, Rudiger Gretschel. So today's episode serves as a sort of follow-up to the webinar where we go over the highlights of the webinar, but I'm super stoked because it gives me another excuse to pick the brains of one of South Africa's undercover wine geniuses. So today I chat to Vinimark's head of production, Rudiger Gretschel, and Rudiger really is a rare gem in that his grasp of the science of winemaking is probably matched only by his love for the philosophy surrounding harmony, sustainability, and integrity in winemaking. He has the rather weird position of spending part of his work week advising some of South Africa's larger bulk wine producers. He likes to call them wine factories. But then he also gets to work alongside people like Johan Reinecker, one of the South African pioneers in the biodynamic movement. The end result of all this experience is a very rare and comprehensively holistic perspective on the South African wine industry, which is why it's such a joy to chat to him today. So Rudiger, before we get into the nitty-gritty of natural wines and biodynamics, I was just wondering, how on earth do you marry working on both ends of the spectrums that we mentioned, the bulk wine and then also the hugely conscious biodynamic? I mean, are you just particularly good at dealing with cognitive dissonance, or is there another way to make sense of it all?
Thanks, Jono. I probably wouldn't go as far as to say that I have psychological stress because of it. On the contrary, I quite enjoy it, to be honest. For me, wine is an unbelievable beverage. Because let's face it, that's at the end of the day, that's what it is. But compared to any other alcoholic beverage, it is, it's truly unique in the sense that it's so vast, so different. It's been around for the last 5 or 6 thousand years. It's been coming along with mankind forever, and it's completely unique. You have this. I always talk about this holy grail of winemaking, which essentially means you want to make a wine that tastes true to the place where it's grown, to the variety it's grown, to the conditions it's grown under. And that's what you can express in the grapes, and ultimately that's what you can express in the bottle of wine. And that's why we get up every morning. That's kind of what inspires me to make wine and be a winemaker. So I've been very privileged, I think, in terms of my career, that I can bridge kind of the world of wine science and at the same time a more holistic approach in terms of biodynamics really well. And believe it or not, there are quite a lot of similarities in it where one can actually marry the two if you're open to it. So yes, I do spend part of my time in a big wine facility, where we crush thousands of tons of grapes and we make, I guess, millions of liters of wine. And on the other hand, I work in this little boutique wine cellar called Reinecker, where we farm biodynamically, and we pretty much tend to every single vine individually and try to make very unique Reinecker wines from the top of the Porcupine Hills. Doesn't cause me stress. It really just, I guess, helps me to understand the ability and the bigger wine picture a lot better.
But I mean, would it be fair to say that the reason you are where you are in your personal philosophy, which is very much that we should all be aiming towards regenerative, sustainable farming, is there no sense that when you are engaging with large producers who don't adhere to those sets of values, that there is some stress in it, or is it simply, are you quite pragmatic about it? I guess that's what I was trying to get at.
No, without a doubt, there is that. So, I followed the South African wine school. I studied at the University of Stellenbosch. I did my enology studies there. And the reality is, it is very Germanic based, so it is very, I guess, very scientific orientated, the course. So I understand it from that part. I fell more into the biodynamic and the regenerative, if you like, winemaking when, growing up drinking wine. The wines I enjoyed drinking the most were the ones that were mostly grown in a much more natural way. Where I don't know. Yeah, I can remember drinking my first bottle of Silex from Didier Dagenais from the Puy, or the wines from Huet from the Vouvray. Um, they're all grown biodynamically, and the wines were so different. They were so unique. They were so special, which kind of got me to explore. I wanted to understand, what is this? What does it mean to be biodynamic? And that's how I kind of fell into it. When I at one day then knocked on Johan Reineke's door, because at that stage he was the only guy doing biodynamic viticulture in South Africa. Like 15 or 16 years ago. Um, but even that, I like very much everything that is wine. I much more prefer people drinking wine than any other alcoholic beverage. So even if it's wine production in a very mass agribusiness scale, I still believe it is a better alcoholic beverage to drink than any other alcoholic beverage. Just think about it. If you have a look at the grape, it is just the shape of it, how it grows, the fruit in itself is just the perfect fruit to be fermented into an alcoholic beverage. I, for example, don't believe that I don't know, cane or potatoes or whatever were given to us by the gods in order to be fermented and distilled into liquor. On the grape, on the other hand, is the perfect fruit to be fermented into wine. So I guess, I understand the commercial realities of the wine business. I don't mind it because I prefer people engaging with wine than any other alcoholic drink. But if the real wine geek comes out in me, obviously I love the idea of growing something as naturally as possible in order to express um, the nuances, the slight differences that you can do in terms of terroir-specific winemaking.
Great. So I feel like there's two thoughts I want to pick up on there. And I want to come back to exactly why the grape is the perfect fruit for fermentation. But before we do that, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, can we spend a little bit of time just unpacking the terms that we've been using in the last minute or two? We started with talking about organic wine and biodynamic wine and natural wine. And obviously, there are areas of overlap, but those three terms are also quite distinct from one another. Can you just spend a few minutes helping us unpack that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you'd probably like to believe that every wine in itself is a natural process. So, the fermentation, you're not supposed to add any additives in winemaking. Again, that's unique to winemaking. Everything that is in the bottle should come from the grape itself. So anything you are supposed to add in winemaking isn't supposed to stay in the wine, so it should either settle out in the terms of fining agents, or it should not be used. If you think about that, that should essentially tell you that each wine is natural in itself. The reality, though, is that, or like everything else in the world, there's progress, and rules get changed. So now all of a sudden there's probably quite a long list of additives that one is allowed to use in winemaking, where you kind of question if they should be used or not. So I guess you all of a sudden have a movement where people distinguish between, I guess, commercial winemaking and then this idea of natural winemaking. Natural winemaking meaning in today's terms very much completely hands off. So there shouldn't be really any intervention whatsoever um, in the vineyard or in the winery. And the winemaker's purpose is really just to guide the grapes into wine, but not so much to try to change something or inflict something or add something for that matter. Organic and biodynamics is a form of agriculture. So organics is very much the idea of growing something that is grown sustainably. So you kind of farm, the idea is you farm for the next generation. You leave something in place better than what you found it. The idea then is very much that you get away from kind of harmful chemical pesticides and herbicides or chemical synthetic fertilizers for the plant, and you work with non-GMO crops. Biodynamics takes it one step further where you start working more towards self-sufficiency instead of just sustainability. So to give you a practical idea is in organic viticulture, you could your vineyard or half of your farm could be organically certified, and half of your vineyards in the other half you could farm conventionally, and you could get certification on that basis. Biodynamics works differently. There, you're kind of in or out. So the idea is more that you view your farm as a closed entity, and everything you do in that, you must do very much in light of non-invasive farming or regenerative farming for that matter. So the idea is very much you try to move away from monocultures. You farm with a whole host of produce in order to create an environment that holistically looks after itself. So to give you a very crass example, if you're a conventional farmer and you want to fertilize, what you can do is you buy synthetic fertilizers, which is a byproduct mostly from fossil fuels, NP and K, that's kind of the elements that a plant needs to grow. You can buy that in a liquid form. You can put it into the drip irrigation when you irrigate your vineyard, and it will feed the roots, and your plant will grow, and it's going to look very lush and very green. If you're an organic farmer, you would probably buy a product like Bounce Back, which comes a little pill, which comes in a plastic wrapper, which is mostly guano or chicken manure, which gets compressed, which you can make a little hole next to the vine and you put it to the soil, and that will slowly release the elements the plant needs to grow. If you're a biodynamic farmer, you would want to, or you would need to make your own compost. The idea would be more you feed the soil, and it is the plant will then, or the soil will become the proper medium for the plant to grow. That's where it needs to take its nutrition from. So, in order to make compost, you obviously need manure. So, you, in all likelihood, are going to get cows. You want perhaps some chicken manure, so you're going to get chickens. You need greens together with the nitrogen in order to make, or you need an organic material in order to make the compost. So you're probably going to have a big veggie garden where there's a lot of greens coming from. And you start making compost, and it's the compost that essentially fertilizes the land in order to grow the crops. Biodynamics then becomes a little bit more complicated in that it's not just about self-sufficiency. You also start seeing things just in light of more of an inherent value. Your value system. You start thinking about that. It's not just you don't just talk about monetary value. The idea is more you talk about value for nature. Obviously in terms of money as well, and then obviously value in terms of people. People who live and work on the lands. We then farm according to these cosmic rhythms as well. So the idea is that um, the Earth and the Moon, its interaction with waning and waxing moons, full moon, new moons, the gravitational forces, and that creates coupled together kind of with the fixed constellations in the sun, and all of these movements have a certain influence on the earth and the plants and all the living beings on earth, and we take very much cognizance of that, and we try to farm according to these influences. And then very much the last pillar of biodynamics is this idea of adding little activators, I guess one could call them, which we call the preparations. There are 8 preparations altogether. 2 of these are field preparations, and then the other six preparations you would use for the compost. And again, it is the idea very much kind of homeopathic activators mostly relies on beneficial plants that our forefathers probably grew up with and always used for ailments. And it's very much these kind of plants that we use to make better compost, to activate our soils, in order to create an environment where you've got a holistic balance, where the crop you grow gets a natural resistance and is less prone to kind of disease, and you will end up making a better wine, hopefully.
So you were talking earlier about lunar cycles and the influence of celestial bodies, and I know that for a lot of people, especially adversaries of movements like biodynamism, often accuse it of having an element of hocus pocus. But Jamie Good made a really interesting comment the other day, saying that actually, as far as he's concerned, science is slowly beginning to catch up to many of the principles that biodynamics have been supporting or proposing for decades. So, what does science say with regards to effects of lunar cycles in agriculture? Is there good literature out there to support those sorts of assertions?
Yeah, so it always depends how you view these things. I think like everything in life, if you're too dogmatic about something, every form of extremism, is probably unhealthy. So you obviously in biodynamics you get that very much the same, I guess, like you would in religion and everything else in life. But if you're too dogmatic about it and you believe it blindly, that's not necessarily the way I like to view it. I think science is super. It's really changed the world for the better greatly too. But I think you can explain certain things scientifically too. So to give you an idea, if you talk about gravitational forces and especially kind of lunar influences on the Earth, very much the idea is if there's a huge pull, liquids will be pulled up. So if you've kind of got a full moon and the moon is very close to the Earth, you will have the greatest gravitational pull, and that would mean kind of moisture in the Earth will be sucked up. That might mean that if you're a biodynamic farmer, there's going to be more moisture in the atmosphere or in your on your farm if that happens. So you should be more cautious in terms of possibly mildew problems. So you farm kind of counteractive to it. But at the same time, if you want to harvest certain crops, it might mean that there's a lot more sap flow in the plant. Yeah. So if you, for example, want to harvest your legumes in your vegetable garden, would make sense to kind of harvest them at that stage. When there's a lot of life, a lot of sap flow in that plant, and it will probably taste better and stay fresher for a long time. And that is something that science can very easily prove. Anybody who surfs will understand tides rising up and down, and high tides and neap tides. Um, where it becomes then a little bit more difficult, for example, you will see biodynamic winemakers that would say to you, you should never wreck your barrel of wine if there is gravitational force, because it might mean that the lees at the bottom of the barrel might just be pulled into the wine, so it might not have settled out so clean. But the reality is, we know from a scientific point of view that gravitational forces really only work on big water masses and not small water masses. So it doesn't really matter when you wreck your barrel of wine. So that is, I guess, very much how science even helps the biodynamic winemaker. So, for example, nowadays we don't at Reinecker worry that much on what day we wreck a barrel of wine, because we understand from a scientific point of view, it doesn't really influence the wine at all what day we wreck it. But the reality is, if it comes to harvesting the fruit, we have experienced and we know that if you harvest the grapes on the right day, especially a fruit day or a flower day, we end up making wines that are yeah, that are just superior if opposed to harvesting them on a root day, for example, which is probably a little bit more difficult to explain scientifically.
Although one of the areas that seems particularly easy to explain scientifically is the area of soil life. And I know that in the last 20 years or so, we have learned huge amounts about microbial life in the soil. And biodynamic preparations that we've been talking about seem to have intuitively understood this for decades. Can you talk a little bit to the progress that science has made with regards to understanding soil life and how biodynamic preparations speak to that?
Yeah, so I think that's essentially what it all boils down to. Any form of sustainable, self-sufficient, regenerative farming, whatever you like to call it. But a type of farming where you just cut out the poison, you kind of, especially the herbicides. Herbicides is the worst. Where you apply something, we know it like glyphosate and Roundup, and it kills everything, it kills the good and the bad, but it essentially nukes everything. It's a desert, nothing is left, no life is left afterwards. And we understand it today. Science has proven it. For example, for a plant, for a root of the plant to take up minerals, you need, it's called a mycorrhiza. It's a little fungus that grows around the root of the plant, which essentially is the enabler for the plant to take up minerals from the soil. Um, once you spray a herbicide, you kill everything. You will kill the mycorrhiza. So all of a sudden, this plant won't be able to take up the trace elements and the minerals and the nutrients it needs from the soil. It doesn't have that ability anymore. So now all of a sudden, the plant is going to wilt. So what do you do as a conventional farmer? You go and you take the synthetic fertilizers, where you really just put NP and K onto the soil in the drip line, like I explained earlier, and your plant will still grow. But now it grows like a little bit like a hydroponic plant. It doesn't really take any of the uniqueness of the soil. So that is something we've understood. That is something that science is starting to be able to measure as well. As an example, we had the University of Stellenbosch out at the Reiniger farm over the last couple of years, looking at the diversity of microbial life on the farm, and it's been staggering. Normally, or compared to our neighboring vineyards, our microbial diversity, it's a thousandfold more. So it's huge, and we understand, in nature, it's this idea of diversity that gives nature the ability to balance itself out. So that's what's happening. We create. Soils that are alive. We bring manure, we bring humus, we bring compost, we bring organic material back into the soils by farming this way. Um, Through this, we activate kind of microbial activity and microbial diversity in that. So the soil, essentially what we call about the soil just coming back to be alive. And again, it's a process called mineralization, where again, it's all scientifically based and factored, where microbes have the ability to change the unmineralized components of the soil into a mineralized form, and it's only really in that form that the plant has the ability to take the nutrients up. So it's all interrelated. It's all interdependent. It's vast. It's diverse, and it's a holistic environment that's created. So, if you want to be hard on science, and I think that is what science is now starting to understand, in the past with science, we always look very much at, you want to explain something, you create a null hypothesis, and you want to explain a single action, or you want to disprove that. We've now learned if it comes to nature, because everything is so very dependent on each other. You can't just look at things in isolation. You need to take a broader picture into consideration, and then it becomes never ending. Because it pretty much is never ending. I guess it's very similar. We as humans, we understand. that, there's this old saying that happiness comes from your stomach. We always thought that's, or the better you eat, then you're going to be happier. That's where that proverb comes from. But it probably isn't. The reality is we now know that it's a diverse gut flora that builds your immune system. Through that, there is channeling through your brain, which again kind of gives you the sense of happiness, which acts against depression. So it's all very much dependent, and that's very much how it works in the soil and microbe life. And if we're talking wine vineyards in that regard.
You mentioned that earlier that in biodynamics, the farm is a closed system. But now you were talking here about how everything is connected. I mean, those are two quite different ideas to marry in the sense that a well-intentioned biodynamic farmer who has created a quote unquote closed system is still dependent on the larger climates in which he's in. So I totally pick up on what you're saying. The task is kind of never ending. So how do you, when you're working with Reinica as a biodynamic certified farm, do you draw the boundaries at the boundary of your farm, or is there a bigger job at play?
No, no, no. I think you misunderstand. The idea is very much you see your farm as a closed system, or let's talk it more as a self-sustaining entity. So the idea is not to have to buy anything on the outside and bring it onto the farm, but rather to produce it yourself in order to create a closed system in terms of farming activities. So to give you an idea, we grow vineyards, we have vegetable gardens, we've got chickens, we have got ducks for the snails. We would seed on certain lands, we would seed grain over the winter period, which we can then harvest and bale because we would need that fodder again for the cows in the really dry seasons if the pasture is diminished at that stage and late in summer. So the idea is that you start moving away from a monoculture environment and have more than just one activity on the farm. And through these various activities, um, life is created. Soil life is created because the cow is an unbelievable animal. Wherever it walks, it also fertilizes. So it's that kind of concept in terms of being self-sufficient. Um, but no, you're obviously reliant on everything on the outside. You can't control the weather. You can't control the rain. You can't control any of that. So it's a little bit like you go sailing on a sailboat. You have to live with the elements instead of living against the elements. I think that's what makes this type of farming special, and different. The conventional farmer nowadays, with kind of the fertilization we have and the chemical sprays and the poisons we have, we can work retrospectively. So you get a systemic spray, which essentially is a poisonous chemical that can penetrate the plant and kill whatever it needs to kill. If you are a sustainable or regenerative or a biodynamic farmer, you can't use any of these poisons, these broad spectrum poisons. So everything you need to do is more precautionary. So you essentially need to farm. Again, I guess like we've unlearned a little bit over the last 60 or 80 years because with this industrial revolution, we started farming very differently, and I think that's what people are starting to see again. That's what wine farmers or farmers in general are starting to learn again, and then all the other benefits come. We know that a healthy soil life absorbs a huge amount of carbon dioxide, which is one of our biggest problems at the moment, just in terms of global warming. Um, so it's all of this that is important. It's difficult to explain where you can just put your finger on one thing. You must really see it in a very wide range, holistic manner to make this work.
Well, I think that's a very powerful image that you used earlier of sailing, sailing a boat using the elements for you rather than fighting against them. I think that's an incredible way of understanding the whole philosophy. I wanted to move out of the vineyard for a small second, or I suppose stay in the vineyard, but move out of the soil and come back to what you said earlier. I feel like there's a whole range of thoughts in the assertion that the grape is the perfect fruit to ferment. Now, I've never put vegetables and fruits in a hierarchy of propensity to ferment. So, what makes you say that a grape is, for example, so much better than a peach?
It's simple. Just have a look at it and taste it. So it can grow. You can go to semi-desert regions across the world, and the only fleck of green you've got is this creeper plant called a vine. Sometimes I wonder if it's not a weed, because essentially it's very difficult to kill. It just flourishes just about anywhere, But so it probably is just that a vine is a creeper plant. So what we do in terms of winemaking, we try to plant it on marginal soils where this growth is not just doesn't just go into vegetative growth, into lushness, into lots of growth and lots of leaves, like you would normally have under your carport if you put a vineyard over that in order to create shade. But the idea is to keep the growth quite marginal in order for the vine to produce grapes. And once you have grapes, it's perfect. You need sugar in order to ferment that down to alcohol, and you need liquid. And if you have a look at the grape, it's perfectly made for that. It's got lots of liquid, and it's just got the right amount of sugar in order to be fermented into the right amount of alcohol in order to make this product biologically stable. And you can see it also in natural winemaking that if you grow it properly, if you have the right fermentation, you can ultimately make a wine that is perfectly stable without any kind of intervention, without any preservative additions in terms of sulfur dioxide, in terms of no filtration. And, again, it is something that will taste vastly different where it's grown, how it's grown, and the seasonal differences, even in terms of the vintages, will also be reflected in the product. So, in my mind, just out of that, it is if we should make alcohol, I believe we should very much only make it out of grapes.
I suppose it is worth noting that there is no burgeoning natural vodka scene. Uh,
No.
but on that topic, and I know we've said this before, that in one sense, there was a time in history when natural wine was the only way to make wine because there were no additives. Uh, but now, natural wine is having a resurgence in the context of this a gap between conventional wine, which is allowed to add all these sorts of additives that have come into use over the years, and natural wine, which is deciding deliberately to avoid those. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on why you think the natural wine movement is exploding now, because it is. I mean, a lot of people accuse it of being a fad or being a trend, but it hasn't shrunk back. It seems to be only growing from strength to strength. And I wanted to get your thoughts on why you think this is happening now.
I think there are various reasons that kind of all culminate together. One of the main ones, I guess, is there's a generation at the moment that doesn't like to live in or that doesn't want to be bound by kind of rules. So it's this idea of free expression. I think you probably find it in every other industry as well, very much like you do in wine. And then I think the one thing where wine really is unique is that you really want to, if you're at the pinnacle of winemaking, this artisanal part of winemaking, and not so much the commercial part. The idea is very much to create something that is unique. It's a very subjective product in that regard, and I think you want if you grow things with great care and you want to express the soil and the climate and the sun and the vintage in the grapes and ultimately in the bottle of wine, and that people can then enjoy, and that story you can tell along with it. You don't want to manipulate that with any sort of additives in the cellar that will definitely impact the taste or the smell or the structure of the wine. So I think it's out of that, just from this artistic element, people wanting to Also, as they like to eat quality and non-poison product, that's exactly the same thing people want to have in their with what they drink. And then I think there are even more different reasons. I think the natural wine, or the more recent natural wine movement, probably over the last 20 years, has also really come to the fore in high-end restaurants. If I have a look at the molecular kitchen that was created, with the beginning of the century with El Bulli and the likes. That type of tasting menu kitchen with young sommeliers, they love this type of winemaking. There are wines that do extremely well with pairing with food. It's kind of writing. It's a revolution in its own right, if you like. So it's always fun to be part of a revolution if you're young. So I think all of these things speak to it. I can even probably venture as far as I was very privileged when I grew up, you know, starting out in winemaking, that I was able to drink, I guess, what we sometimes deem as the best wines in the world. So kind of the first or the class growths out of Bordeaux. Want to taste the Petrus at one stage. And if you go to the Rhone Valley, you want to drink the Lala wines from Bigal, and you want to drink Chartres Hermitage, and you want to drink Jamet's Côte Rôtie. And you go to Burgundy and you want to drink the Domaine Romani Conti single vineyards, from Grand Echezeux all the way, Richebourg, Saint-Vivant, La Romani. And these wines, so I was privileged enough, to be exposed to these wines, 20, 25 years ago. Thing now is these wines have become so unbelievably expensive and are mostly traded. Is that us as mere mortals just can't afford them anymore. Now it's all of a sudden a big deal when you get to drink one of these wines. And I think a lot of young sommeliers or young people who start out in the wine industry now, they obviously hear about these wines, they read about them, but they don't have an opportunity to taste these wines anymore. So this identity is lost. So I think natural wine is a nice substitute for that, in the sense that it's all very exciting, and at the moment it's all very young, and the wines are very expressive. They can be unbelievably good, and it's just something they could identify with a lot easier, and also be able to what's the right word, to identify themselves with. So I think a lot of these wines found themselves onto the right wine menus. People started engaging with them to the point where all of a sudden, you can have natural or raw wine fairs across the world that pull great crowds, and people interact with these products, which at the beginning seemed to be very much of a fad and was frowned upon by the winemaking elite, and now all of a sudden is a proper category, which is great, which is awesome. That's exactly what we need.
So, so far in this conversation, Rudiger, we've been talking to you as an expert and you've been sharing your insights. But I wanted to get you to think for a bit and tell me, what are some of the areas right now where you feel like you are a student, where it's really exciting you, that there's new fields of study, that there are areas you want to stretch yourself in your winemaking? What is topical in the brain of Rudiger Gretschel right now?
Uh, Probably the most at the moment is this idea of microbe or microbe terroir. We a lot of times we try to explain, for example, wines in Burgundy grow in limestone soils, and then all of a sudden the taste you can get, has like a minerality to it. And then we try to understand, what does that even mean, minerality? What does that look like? And we get different forms of minerality, and the one is chalky, and the other one is wider, and the other one is a little bit reductive, and the other one looks more like a spiral. And we try to make sense out of all of this. And we now seem to not understand, but start to look more into this idea of, maybe terroir is very much microbe activity in the soil. Certain something changes, and that gives you the ability to have a different taste in the grapes, and not even just in the grapes, but after the fermentation or the metabolic processes have happened in the winemaking process, that all of a sudden you get wines that speak a sense of the place, but the sense of the place is not just the soil. It is very much these little microbes that also live within the soil. I think that's why you see it more and more in terms of fine wine growing worldwide, that vineyard vineyard owners and winemakers are starting to grow things in a lot more of a sustainable and natural manner, where they leave away these herbicides and fungicides and pesticides in order to have souls that are alive again. So that's kind of where my what I'm trying to make sense of, So to give you an idea, is this idea of thiols. It's kind of the flavor profile that you have in winemaking, that you get certain varieties that have it more than others. It's a precursor that starts in the grape and comes from the soil, and then during the fermentation process is converted and gives you, it's always a sulfur binding in terms of the protein, the amino acids, how it's put together. But it gives you a flavor, mostly if you get it right, of kind of grapefruit and passion fruit. It's a great, great flavor. Um, it can even move over into more of a mineral or a taste of minerality if it's a little bit more reduced. Then you can get it completely wrong, and all of a sudden, it's a proper H2S sulfur binding, and it smells of rotten eggs. So it's these type of things that probably fascinate me the most at the time.
It would be amazing if the next generation of sommeliers and industry professionals had to talk about soil and climate and prevalent microbes in a region. So the definition of Burgundy would include a module on the microbes of the region, or how they show themselves. I mean, that's just it's a mind-blowing idea.
I think that is very much where it is, where it's headed to. I sit on one of the committees of Wine Tech, which is an industry body which we have in South Africa that funds research in wine and viticulture, and I see it more and more. I see uh, the master students and the doctor students applying for these bursaries, and the topics they want to research. How much it goes into this area more and more. It's quite something.
Well, Rudiger, I found today absolutely fascinating. I see we've run way over time, but I didn't want to cut off any of the ideas that you've been sharing with us, because I think they're pure gold. And I think as I said earlier, there are very few people who get to see wine so clearly from such a wide range of perspectives. So thank you so much for giving all your time today. I know you've been very busy, and I really look forward to finding another excuse to get you on the line and chat to you more about the work that you're doing here in South African wine.
Anytime.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it, and have a lovely day.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vinimark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.